Thank you for joining us for today's session. I'm your host, Debbie Mathias with the Build Initiative. We'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement from Giovanna Archuleta, Assistant Secretary for the New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department.
I would like to open up this meeting acknowledging our Mother Earth and the land she nurtures us with, the land where our children grow, and the land that provides the food to feed them. When we talk about these resources, we must also acknowledge the lands of our tribal people and the deep spiritual and long-standing relationship of all tribal nations. Today I come from you from Nambe Winge, the land of my ancestors who cared for it and fought for it so that I may one day live and raise my own children on it. A relationship that predates colonial contact by thousands of years. Our ancestors still speak to us and guide us through our songs, ceremonies, and writings. Through removal, trail of tears, long walks, assimilation, and the idea that by removing children would kill a culture. Our ancestors did not give up. Our tribal people are some of the most resilient people in our country, continuing to raise children to be resilient, who are nurtured through language and culture, the language and culture that cannot be removed. We must also acknowledge all other spirits who were forcefully displaced from their homelands and trafficked for labor and production on sacred native land. All of us collectively continue to experience the adversity this caused our ancestors and spirits who continue to hurt from actions done to them. Take a moment to pray these people find the healing and peace to raise their children in a world that has so many opportunities, but most importantly, create coexistence free of violence. Tribal people are praying people. This is where we are all tied. Our grandmothers and mothers continue to pray over us. And as tribal people pray, they pray for people in the north, in the east, in the south, and the west. They pray for infants, children, adults, and elders, and our non-human relations, each with knowledge to share with us. As this conference begins, I hope that each of you are balanced in all directions and take a moment to appreciate what Mother Earth has given to us and how she continues to nurture us in many ways. I invite and encourage you to learn who are the original stewards of the land you live and work on and support those nations and children of those lands. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. The Build team is excited to present this 20 webinars in 20 days for QRIS 2020 as we explore ideas, possibilities, and learn together about how we might recreate better, more equitable systems with children, families, and early childhood professionals at the center of our efforts. We're grateful to the many individuals who took time to prepare sessions, generate content, and ideas to share. We believe the sessions will inspire you to build on these ideas, continue conversations, and innovate back in your own communities and states. Boy, we've learned a great deal as we prepared for the virtual events. One of our lessons is that a virtual event draws a much broader audience than an in-person conference does. The Build QRIS conference was designed for early childhood system leaders at the national, state, territory, tribal, nation, and community levels. As the registrations rolled in for the virtual event, discovered many direct service providers from teachers to center directors and home-based providers signing up for sessions. We welcome you to our learning community and look forward to hearing your perspective and ideas. We encourage you to share your comments, ideas, and questions in the chat box. As you know, we had to pivot from our in-person conference to a virtual conference. We'd like to say a sincere thank you to our sponsors, who made that switch possible. Their support is essential to the event. Well, we've all become very familiar with the Zoom platform over the past few months as we've used it to connect with families, friends, community, and colleagues. We want to point out a few features that may be new to you. First, you can choose your view. In the upper right-hand corner, click on the speaker view to see the active speaker, or click on the gallery view to see everyone. Next, we want to encourage you to provide feedback throughout the session by clicking on participants along the bottom to open up the participant list, and then clicking on the icons at the bottom of the participant list to respond to questions or give us a thumbs up. Presenters may also use this feature to do some quick polling, so be ready. Chat with us or with each other. We encourage you to be active participants in this session. Please share your ideas, experiences, and questions in the chat box. There will be some polls in the session. A box will pop up on your screen, and we encourage you to respond. This helps us generate more conversation and enhances our learning together. Well, now it's a great pleasure to turn the session over to Cemeré James to introduce our session leaders and launch our session.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Cemeré James. I am Senior Vice President of Policy. Thank you all so much for joining this presentation. Thank you, Debbie, as host. You can think of me as your MC for the session. We have myself, as I said, we have Will Dunbar, Vice President of Policy at the National Black Child Development Institute. We have Bob Stechuk, Director of Early Childhood Education Programs at UnidosUS, and Christine Staub Johnson. I'm Senior Policy Analyst at the Center, Senior Policy Analyst for Child Care and Early Education at CLASP. I'll ask each presenter, just as they are presenting, just before they're presenting to introduce themselves and say a little bit more about themselves before their presentation. NBCDI, Unidos, CLASP are organizations that are focused on the importance of racial equity, not only for our families and children, but also for our educators. We're pleased today to work together on this session that will focus on educators of color. I'll kick us off sharing more about NBCDI. I just want to make sure that I introduce us as an organization. Will and Bob will again bring the historical perspective and emphasize why we must ensure that we focus on equity, diversity, and quality to ensure we give those equal importance in early childhood education. We'll then transition into breakout sessions and have smaller group discussions to examine the need of providers and educators of color during this pandemic. As we regroup and in many cases reopen the early childhood industry, we have to ensure that this takes place in a way that's equitable and emphasizes quality and emphasizes diversity as well. After we take that time to reflect and discuss how the pandemic is impacting people of color in ECE, Christine Staub Johnson, Johnson-Staub, will follow up with principles of anti-racist policies. And we'll close the session on that note after a brief Q&A. We also will continue the discussion on July 22nd. Christine will lead a session that will consider the second in kind of a series. That session will be on committing to anti-racist childcare policies and how we honor, how states can honor families and workers of color through their subsidy systems. So consider this the first in a conversation that will continue. As I said, I will kick us off. If we go on to the next slide, I'll kick us off with a brief overview of NBCDI. so that we are properly introducing ourselves as an organization. And moving to the next slide, NBCDI's mission is to improve and advance the quality of life for Black children and families through education and advocacy. Our national affiliate network spans the country from one coast to the other. In partnership between national and local, we focus on taking a strengths-based approach and a holistic approach to advocating for Black children and families, and we can go ahead to the next couple of slides. To advocating for Black children and families, and to providing programming focused on young children and families as well. On the next slide as well, we share our focus areas, starting with early childhood education, health and wellness, again, taking that holistic approach, family engagement, literacy, child welfare, and policy and advocacy. Lastly, before I turn it over to William Dunbar, who will again share historical perspective, NBCDI's action agenda I'm sharing specifically because we have a balance of supporting families and also supporting educators, and just wanted to share how important we believe it is to support our educators that engage and support our families on a daily basis, especially during the time of this pandemic. We'll transition to William Dunbar.
Thank you, Cemeré. Like Cemeré said, my name is William Dunbar, and I am the Vice President of Policy for the National Black Child Development Institute. So thank you all again for joining and participating. It's a small background, a small context about myself is that I have a 15-year career in the public policy space, particularly in the education space. I'm working in not only nonprofits, but also working on Capitol Hill directly for elected officials. So we wanted to highlight, in particular, our work around the responsible, in our white paper around the responsible transformation of our early childhood education and workforce initiatives. This paper was developed by NBCDI in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The responsible transformation of the early childhood education workforce initiative is focused on examining the impacts of new educational requirements that may have the requirements, how they may impact Black early childhood educators. Also, as you can see, exploring how best to implement a bachelor's degree requirement for early childhood educators in communities that serve Black children by strengthening and not displacing the current workforce. Our goal with this initiative in our white paper is to provide recommendations to increase access to high quality early childhood education by raising education requirements in the early childhood education workforce without displacing Black educators. Next slide, please. What you'll see on this next slide is that in May 2019, Education Week reporter Madeline Williams wrote an article entitled 65 Years After Brown versus Board, Where Are All the Black Educators? In the article, she writes, 65 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation of the children in public schools was unconstitutional. That decision for the first time afforded Black children access to the same educational opportunities as white children. Although many schools remain de facto racially segregated today, the decision is heralded as one of the country's most significant milestones for civil rights. But Brown also had an unintended consequence, the effects of which are still felt today. It caused the demotion, or forced resignation of many experienced, highly credentialed Black educators who staffed Black-only schools. After the decision, tens of thousands of Black teachers and principals lost their jobs as white superintendents began to integrate schools, but fought against putting Black educators in position of authority over white teachers or students. Next slide, please. So here are some of the results soon after the Supreme Court's ruling. As you can see, 38,000 Black teachers and administrators in 21 southern and southern boarding states lost their jobs. Black principals were also demoted in mass. For example, in Alabama, a number of Black principals, the number of Black principals declined from 210 to 57. Or in the case of Virginia, the number of Black principals declined from 170 to 16. Next slide, please. So for us, it was important to identify what the next steps look like as we develop and introduce our responsible transformation white paper. Early childhood educators should be, we believe that early childhood educators should be adequately compensated for meeting the bachelor's degree requirements, and all employees should be held accountable to meeting the minimum pay. Thus, there is a need to create there's a need to create equity in the system to ensure that these programs can hire and adequately pay staff with the highest level of education and experience. Redlining, discrimination, and loans and quality funding to Black early childhood educators have created inequities that must be addressed in this process. So as a result, our NBCDI envisions that every child in early childhood education will have well-educated and well-compensated early childhood educators who earn a living wage and have access to affordable college education. So we are advocating for equity, diversity, and quality in all students' education, and particularly, and they're also early childhood educators. I will pass it. Yep.
Thank you, Will, for that presentation, for really highlighting the points about the importance of focusing on equity now because of how our educators suffered through a time where they lost so many opportunities and were really disenfranchised, so many Black educators disenfranchised in the K-12 space. We want to ensure that we are cognizant and protect the diversity that we have that's so rich in the ECE space. I will, if there are no questions that I should, I didn't see any questions come in the chat. We hope that you'll engage more in the chat box, but I will go ahead and transition to Bob Stechuk from Unidos.
So good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by thanking all of the people at QRIS. So Deb, Danielle, Jen, thanks for pulling this off. It's quite a bit different from New Orleans last year. But thank you again for doing this. And thank you to my co-panelists. It was a real pleasure and an honor to be a part of planning this. And then thanks to all of you who are participating in this virtual session as well. So my name is Bob. I've been in early childhood pretty much my entire adult life. A long time ago when I was young, I worked as a classroom teacher in childcare settings that were diverse, multilingual. I worked with children as young as 16 months of age. I actually field tested the infant toddler CDA, if that rings a bell. I've had a variety of positions in Head Start. I was a TA provider to migrant and seasonal Head Start programs for a long time. And I was the co-director of the National Center on Cultural and Linguistic Responsiveness between 2010 and 2015. I've been with UnidosUS since 2016. If you're not recognizing the name, for the first 50 years, the organization went by the name National Council of La Raza. It was founded in 1968. And for our 50th anniversary, there was a decision to change the name. There's a long story behind it. I won't tell it now. If you want to contact me, if you want to send me an email, I'll be glad to share the information. We have about 300 affiliate organizations nationwide. About 60 of those operate some form of early childhood programming, primarily in terms of Head Start and state pre-K programs. So let's go to the next slide. And so we can go to the next slide too. So all of you are, I'm thinking most of you are familiar with this slide. As you, my task is to talk about ECE, the field before COVID-19. So that's either going to be a real pleasure or a very unenviable task. All of you know about the diversity within the workforce. In 2018, we conducted 10 teacher focus groups with the Hispanic staff on the left circle of the graphic, so center-based teaching staff. We conducted 10 teacher focus groups involving 94 participants. We also had a grant funded by the Gates Project, similar to the effort that Will just described. So we can go to the next slide. And I just want to draw out a few pieces of the situation pre-COVID. So we spoke with 94 Latino early childhood educators, 91 females, 3 men. All of them gave us really great information. And we spoke with a very experienced group. So about 1/3 of our participants had 16 or more years of experience in the field. Another 1/3 had between 10 and 15 years. And the overwhelming story was that people came into the field, started at entry-level positions and worked their way up. So they started in the kitchen, they started as a floater, they moved up to be an assistant, they became a lead teacher. That we heard virtually in every single location. And so before I forget, all of the focus group information is captured in our report, which is on our website. It looks like this. If you go to the UnidosUS website, click on the Publications tab, our ECE Workforce Report is waiting for your download. In addition to that, I want to call your attention to a practice brief that we developed that we enjoyed doing a great deal. So during our focus groups with these experienced early childhood educators, we asked them, well, what do good teachers do? And they had lots and lots to say. And in location after location, people kept saying, you know, we prioritize, we work really hard to create a sense of belonging among our children. From the very first day of the program year and throughout, we think it's really important that children feel a sense of belonging. And so we captured 7 specific strategies that teachers identified. We convey those in the actual voices of the teachers. And in addition to the 7 specific strategies, we also identified the strategic thinking that teachers bring. So in addition to mentioning specific strategies, the teachers talked about beginning the program year. They talked with a certain set of strategies in mind. They talked about individualizing the strategies based on individual children's needs. And they talked about combining different strategies to meet children's individual needs. And then they talked about altering the use of strategies over time. So we had a lot of fun putting that together. That's on our website as well. In addition, we talked to our teachers about the importance of children's home languages. We've created a document addressing linguistic responsiveness. I won't go into that now, but it's there as well. So there are many long-term trends that were going on in ECE before COVID-19. So we have an expanding research base on how important child development is. Over time, there were increases in federal and state spending. Many of the teachers in our focus groups were faced with the third bullet, which was having been in the field for many years, having worked their way into a lead teacher position. People were told, oh, sorry, you have to earn a BA degree in order to keep your position. In a nutshell, what we found is that the majority of people who were given that, that situation elected to stay in their profession. So our interviews with program administrators and with teachers indicated that small numbers of people chose to leave the field because of the BA requirement. But in each of the locations, people told us that the majority of people stayed in place and took on the difficult task of earning a degree while working full-time. If we could go to the next slide, please, that would be great. So the two sort of themes that came out of our focus groups that I just want to touch on were one, in terms of stresses and stressors. And the second theme that emerged equally strong was in terms of the staying power of people in the profession. People told us why they stayed. So during the focus groups, every single location told us that their jobs are stressful, right? No surprise there. And they detailed the increasing amount of stress that they as ECE teachers face. So in terms of safety procedures, people talked about increasing requirements. So people said, well, we used to take attendance once a day. Now we're required to do it every hour. So that vigilance in terms of children's safety is a source of stress. People talked about increased paperwork, increased responsibility. And then I added on top of that, many people face the requirement of earning a bachelor's degree in order to keep their position. Teachers also talked about the stressors that children and families faced. And I don't have time to go into all of the details, but what we kept hearing in location after location was the phrase, within the last 3 years, within the last 3 years. So people would say, I've been a teacher for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. We're seeing higher incidences of challenging behavior. We're seeing more trauma within the last 3 years. We're seeing more frequent issues and more severe issues within the last 3 years. Now, in addition to talking about stress, the teachers also talked about why they stay in the field. So basically, there are 3 pieces to that. One is that the teachers found their work with children to be personally rewarding, not necessarily financially, but personally rewarding. People talked about their involvement in supporting children's development and having an impact on the growth and learning that children were doing. So this slide up here is aimed at addressing the question of why do we need to maintain diversity in the field? So this is yet another contextual factor for ECE pre-COVID. So, and we can go to the next slide. So and we can go to the next slide. I'm trying to be as effective as I can with time. So the question is, why is it important to maintain and support a diverse workforce? there are many reasons. One is that the diversity of the workforce brings ECE teachers who are familiar with the culture of the family and of the child, and who can have specific insights into supporting children's identity formation. Another reason is that it supports effective family engagement and linguistic responsiveness. But above all, it's essential to recognize that a diverse workforce allows the ECE teachers to understand children's lived experiences, to understand what children are going through, and then to use those experiences both to support children to cope with the events in their lives as well as to support learning. So prior to COVID-19, we found the field, as Will just pointed out, there's a huge and imperative to increase teachers' compensation, so that the compensation that teachers receive is commensurate with their job responsibilities and the importance of child development. The other pieces are the importance of increasing supports and resources for the workforce, for children, and for families, and the need to maintain and expand diversity in order to best support children's growth. All that is now accelerated with the spread and continuing effects of the pandemic. So next slide. So in our view, the work that we're doing at UnidosUS and hopefully in other places as well, we see two key priorities. One is in terms of developing a child-centered approach to well-being, an approach that takes into account children's developmental changes during the preschool period. So amidst COVID-19, children's memory is increasing, their capacity for reflective thinking, their ability to connect pieces of information. All of that will show up in the kinds of questions that they asked and the way that they will respond. We know that unfortunately that all the information about disparities is amplified during the global pandemic. So we know that Black families and Latino families are testing positive at a much higher rate and are experiencing fatalities at a much higher rate. So in our view, there needs to be a child-centered approach to promoting well-being that supports children through the developmental pieces that they're going through and that are aggravated by the presence of COVID-19. And then the final piece is in terms of the importance of expanding our approaches to family engagement amid COVID-19. So the need is there for parents, caregivers, and program staff to collaborate as never before, to share observations of children, to reflect on the kinds of questions that children are asking, the kinds of behaviors that we're observing in children, and then planning and working together to prepare ways of responding and ways of interacting with children. So I think with that, I've completed my segment of the presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Cemeré.
Thank you so much, Bob. And we appreciate both Bob and Will for clearly highlighting the point that the diversity of our children should definitely be reflected in the diversity of our educators, and that we have to take care, special care, to support educators of color. But a lot of the research and data that we gathered was in an environment that doesn't match how quickly our world has changed. And so we wanted to take really the bulk of the time, or a good significant amount of the time on this session, to go into breakouts. And I know that our support at Build will start that movement. They've put the questions for our discussion sessions and breakout in the chat. I do want to acknowledge Shara Greenwood put in the chat a question about how we talk to children about the disparities in the effects of COVID-19 on people of color. And so, Sarah, I encourage you to raise that among the other questions that come up in your breakout session, or we'll keep it and reserve it for our Q&A after Christine Johnson-Staub's presentation. So, Jen, Debbie, if we can go ahead and move into the breakout sessions, that would be great. Hi, I'm gonna give everyone just a few seconds to make sure we have everyone back in from the breakout sessions. So I'm gonna get us started then on a very quick, it's gonna be pretty quick and brief, but I'll ask those who facilitated conversations just to share the top 2 things you learned about what we can do to support educators of color in particular in this field, or people of color in the ECE field during COVID-19. I'll quickly share, I think the strongest points in our conversation in my breakout session was just ensuring that we recognize the social emotional development that children may be missing right now as they're at home and have less access to children their age. The fact that with higher rates of death in communities of color, those children will have experienced trauma at higher rates. And we talked about just effective strategies that are important for educators and for parents to engage with parents and children. I don't remember the name, but one from our group said how much, as teachers were calling families to check on them, how much it also benefited teachers because they were missing the connections that they had with families prior to COVID-19. So I'll ask, just jump in as you have great report arts to share from other facilitators, if you can share just a couple of things that were highlights from your discussion.
Hi, Cemeré, this is Christine. In our group, I'll just highlight that the 2 things that jumped out at me is, one, people talked about the importance of having regular informal ways to get input from educators and others in the field, like weekly phone calls, surveys going out regularly, other kinds of outreach efforts, but doing it in a really kind of regular way. And then related to that, we had a number of representatives from community-based organizations, like from North Carolina, from California, where there are kind of community hubs around early childhood that are playing an important role in connecting people to both to resources, but also helping to understand what's going on in the community with the providers who are connected. So that is helpful in having a more local contacts that know more of the providers in the community and can kind of keep in touch with them.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll share, everyone. Hi, this is Ashley Williams from the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment. Thank you to the folks that were in our breakout session, and thank you, Candice, for sharing that on-screen connection. There's one thing that stood out that Casey from New Jersey shared, is that how kind of advocates were and she didn't go into a lot of detail. She dropped it in the chat, but I thought it would be interesting to hear more about or learn more about. But advocates hosting communities of practice with educators to kind of talk about their experiences during this time, and using that opportunity of engaging in community of practice to then kind of translate that to take it back to the state to say, okay, this is what we're hearing, these are the needs. So I thought that that was a takeaway that folks can kind of consider a community of practice. And another thing that Cemeré, you kind of talked about the aspect of the impact of this on you know, children and families and educators. And we talked about that each and every one of us are human beings in this right now. And talking about how important it is for us to be thinking about mental health and what this means for educators, what it means for children, what it means for their families, and more resources needed to help people understand how to respond and how to actually support what post, you know, COVID, because a lot of these issues were happening before COVID. We work in early childhood, so these were things that we were seeing before. They're just exacerbated during this pandemic. So that was just, I would say, 2 takeaways I would share from our breakout group. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. I think that's perfect as we go into Christine Johnson-Staub's presentation, because we're talking about the fact that the issues, the inequities that we may see in the field are historical per Will and Bob's presentation. And so Christine is going to present on how we take an anti-racist approach. I want to go ahead and have Christine get started. For those who didn't share out, if you can add anything you really want us to take away in the chat box, please. And for facilitators, please email us, either chat or email us at policy@nbcdi.org. I'll put it in the chat as well. Thanks, Christine.
Great. Thank you, Cemeré. So just to introduce myself, for those who I haven't met, I'm Christine Johnson-Staub. I'm a senior policy analyst in childcare and early education at CLASP, which is the Center for Law and Social Policy. We're a national anti-poverty organization that has a focus on racial equity, and we work on a number of different policy areas. Obviously childcare and early education, but also workforce development, post-secondary education, income and work supports, job quality, and youth development, and justice, immigration. We keep adding teams, so I want to make sure to get all of them. But it's part of my job too is helping to coordinate across those issue areas on our state level work. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some principles around doing anti-racist policy work, particularly during the COVID era and in the early childhood field. But there are lessons that are drawn and that we try to work on across our policy areas. And then I'm also going to quickly share some examples of specific kind of places where state policymakers make decisions that affect childcare and early education, and can take an anti-racist approach to doing that. So I'm going to go ahead and ask for the next slide. Next slide. There it is. So I'm going to highlight 3 principles for anti-racist policymaking. Specifically, these are not specific to childcare and early education, but I drew them from a longer set of principles and considerations that CLASP developed recently to guide our work during the pandemic. So they can be applied to kind of any kind of policy making, but what you'll find is that they really echo some of the conversations, at least that we had in our small group, and certainly that Will and Bob talked about earlier, that there are some echoes of those types of considerations. The first one is really that racial equity isn't an add-on, that it is front and center in every policy decision and every step of the policymaking process. So when you're working, whether you're in the field, contributing your experiences and stories to policymaking, whether you're an advocate, whether you're in the state house, or whether you're funding the work, every step of the process should be seen through an equity lens to make sure that it takes steps to counter historic inequities experienced by people of color, and particularly the Black community, and really takes the next step to dismantle racist structures and histories and create new, more inclusive structures and histories and policy. The second, which maybe should be the first, it's hard to prioritize these, is to center policy work on the voices of people with lived experiences throughout the policymaking process. And I think this may be one of the more challenging ones, particularly for people who have worked in a more traditional kind of early education field for a long time, that historically we've really had a field that has been influenced by experts, and has been influenced by child development experts, and has been influenced by people in charge of schools, and it has not been inclusive in terms of, and reflected the voices of people who've worked in childcare, who've worked in early education classrooms, who are educators, who are caregivers. And it hasn't always reflected the voices of parents. So it's really a time to be listening as we make policy, and as we consider what policy changes need to be implemented or designed, listening to people's experiences with the policies that exist, listening to what people need, listening to leaders coming out of communities of color to really shape new types of policies, and to build new partnerships so that we're not, so that people aren't, so it isn't a matter of people who are currently in power asking for the voices of people who, people who are Black or people of color, but it's a partnership that is authentic, and is a partnership where tables are being built together to hear those voices and to be led by those voices. And then the third principle that I really want to highlight, and I think this is particularly important right now because we are in a public health and an economic crisis. And so we're making decisions very quick. I don't know about you all, but I feel like every day things are changing really fast. Policy decisions are being made really quickly by lots of different people. And it's tempting to really just focus on what's right in front of us, but we really have to both make sure that we respond to the immediate needs and the urgency of the time, and that we are at the same time contributing to and forging a path to more equitable, systemic, long-term solutions and structures. And again, dismantling racist policies and co-creating new policies and structures that are better going to serve a diverse workforce, that are better going to serve diverse families, and that are going to be anti-racist. Those are kind of three big principles I want to carry on, and now I'm going to try to quickly apply them to a few different policy areas. So if I could have the next slide, please. There are three areas of policy within childcare and early education that I think really impact the workforce. There are many more, but these are the three that I'm going to talk about today. One is how we define quality. Two is how we value the workforce and compensate the workforce. And the third is equitable professional development and education. So in thinking about defining quality, I think we historically have relied a lot on child development research to define what quality is. And sometimes it's been about the interaction between adults and children. Sometimes it's been about program characteristics. And I know many of you have been involved in these conversations, particularly around developing quality rating systems. And all of those things are really important. But all of those things also have embedded in them inequities. So data isn't collected equitably all the time. People are left out of the conversations. Children aren't viewed the same way, even in very well-defined or well-designed research. So there are some really important steps in policy that need to happen to take an anti-racist approach to defining quality. One is including equitable workforce qualifications and standards, and I really liked what was being said earlier about that implementing higher workforce qualifications that don't displace educators of color. That seems like a really critical and defining piece. So a lot of this depends on systems that we know exist in the workforce development space, higher education, workforce and training programs. We know they're not equitable, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, or they're not always equitable. And so, so thinking about designing workforce qualifications and standards that don't leave people out or push people out, that quality should be defined not just by quote unquote experts who have degrees, but they should be informed by educators and caregivers of color and by parents and communities, because quality is not an objective characteristic, really. It has a lot of subjective pieces to it, which then opens the way for inequities. A third part is elevating the strengths and assets of a diverse workforce, and thinking about, and Bob talked about this a little bit, about the impact on quality of children's experiences and adults' experiences, that a diverse workforce contributes to better outcomes for children, better development for children, a better sense of self, and also better relationships and opportunities for adults to learn and grow from each other. And so that's important too. And then kind of as the umbrella, quality rating systems. I know many of us work and support quality rating systems at the state level. Really important that they incorporate, that the design of quality rating systems incorporate diverse perspectives of quality. And I've just moved to the next slide because I know I'm running behind here. The next area is around valuing early childhood professionals. And I think we talk a lot about salaries and compensation and benefits, and it's a huge, huge issue in the field. We also have a very stratified workforce that is disproportionately women of color, disproportionately Black women. And statistically speaking, women of color tend to be in the lower paid positions within the childcare and early education workforce, and in the positions that have less power. So that's the piece that we want to design policies to counter, to make the valuing of early childhood professionals more equitable. So there's, again, is ongoing communication with and leadership from people who are directly impacted by the policies. And that's a theme through this whole, I think, through this whole session. And it's easy to say, but it's not easy to do. So in our small group, I know we talked about the ways that you really have to be intentional about reaching out to communities of color, to reaching providers who may not necessarily be in the traditional pipelines of information, to making sure you're hearing from everyone. One way of thinking about that is also using disaggregated and qualitative data to equitably distribute funding for compensation and for benefits and for programs, so that programs aren't disproportionately underfunded, programs that have more workers of color and programs that are serving communities of color aren't inequitably funded. But data only goes so far, and it's really, I want to emphasize that qualitative data piece, because we know that the data is only good as what's collected, and how questions are designed and how surveys are distributed. So really important to have multiple ways of collecting the experiences and of understanding the experiences of people of color in the field. Valuing early childhood professionals takes a significant investment in public funding, tracking the use of those dollars, making sure that they're getting to everyone, and making sure that they're getting to the most underserved communities. And then equitable compensation, benefits, job safety, access to healthcare, these all fall under the category of job quality. I think, you know, if you look across early childhood programs, they don't all look the same in terms of how well they're funded and what it takes to work there, and whether they have things like paid time off, paid sick leave, paid family leave. But all of those things, particularly in a time of a pandemic and an economic crisis, are really critical to having equitable workplaces that are treating staff equitably and compensating them equitably. But we know that communities of color have been disproportionately impacted both by the health effects of the pandemic and the economic effects. So to counter that, we really need to make sure that programs are, that all early childhood workers have access to quality jobs. And I'll go to the next slide. Finally, the next area is around career advancement, and I think we've talked a lot about that throughout the session, so I won't spend too much time on it, but really traditionally designed college programs, post-secondary programs, training, workforce development programs have left a lot of people behind or have been targeted in ways that have provided less effective training and education to communities of color. So to counter that through a policy lens, it really takes us evaluating how the workforce gets its education, who has access, how to support workers of color, educators of color to get the professional development and training that they need and want, and making sure that those opportunities are available to all types of workers, and that includes having linguistic access, it includes geography, it includes having cohorts or other opportunities in communities of color, and it includes reaching out to educators who are in all settings, including informal, licensed exempt caregivers, those who are in linguistically diverse communities, non-English speaking communities, and making sure that that all of the supports that go along with that and are often available through QRIS systems, like professional development, quality improvement supports, family support programs, coaching, mentoring, that all of those things are available in the whole variety of settings and to everyone involved. So I know I'm short on time. I think originally I was going to also give a federal update to this group, but Cemeré, I'm just going to check in with you and see if you still want me to do that or if we should just go on to have any questions or discussion.
I would ask that you give us a quick federal update, and then if folks have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We can always respond to them following this call.
Okay, I'll try to make it less than a minute then. Underlying all of this work that we've been talking about is the need for resources. So I want to talk about federal resources. So far, $3.5 billion have been allocated to direct child care relief through the CARES Act. And I'm just going to talk mostly about pandemic-related federal policy. And you can go to the next slide, although I don't think it has a lot on it, actually. The House has passed a second package of $3 trillion with $7 billion dedicated to child care. And the Senate is working on their own and expected to come out with that after the July recess, which ends on July 17th. So both chambers and both parties have shown support for childcare investments up to $100 billion. Just been a whole range of proposals. We are obviously pushing for as much dedicated childcare money as possible. And there are also several other childcare bills that have been introduced, and we're most focused on the comprehensive Child Care is Essential Act, which includes $50 billion, and those dollars can support fixed costs of operating programs. So not just salaries, not just slots, but actually the kind of, programmatic costs like rent and utilities that programs are dealing with even when they're closed. There's some other bills that are focused on infrastructure and other supports, but those aren't moving as quickly. And I think we're focusing most of our attention on Child Care is Essential. And then separately from the pandemic-related efforts, appropriations is moving forward as it does kind of normally in these times. It's moving forward, but it's under very tight budget caps, which were established last year. And it may include some really small increases to the Child Care and Development Block Grant, which helps fund subsidies. In the House Labor, Health and Human Services appropriation that included $100 million, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually really small from in federal terms. And the Senate Labor, Health and Human Services Appropriations Committee is going to make its recommendation after the July recess, which again ends on July 17th. So the headline is, there are some packages moving right now to put more pandemic-related funding into the hands of childcare providers, but we need to really be pushing for a high number, for at least 50 billion, if not 100 billion, and for the Senate to move on it quickly when they return from recess. So call your members of Congress or email them. And that's my update. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this call. As I said, I hope you'll also be able to join the session where we'll dive even deeper into anti-racist policies and how we use those, how those apply, those principles apply to our field and supporting people of color and families of color through ECE. Thank you again all so much for coming. Please stay on to complete the survey, and I'll turn it over to Debbie, who I think has more.
That's right, Cemeré. Before you sign off, we encourage you to give us some feedback on today's session. Some poll questions are popping up on your screen, and let us know in the chat box what was useful, significant, or new, and how we might improve sessions in the future. I'd really like to thank our session leaders today for this interesting opportunity for discussion and engagement around such important questions. We appreciated the contributions from our participants in the chat box and in the breakout rooms. Thanks to everyone for joining in today, and hope to see you again soon.